What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the term's a deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy
the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and if you listened to our first few episodes, then you know that over the last few months, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of conversations, sometimes more than once per day, with up to 30,000 live listeners and participants, where we all hear live and direct from people in the news, in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of our live conversations for the first time, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Today, we're very excited to release part of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with John Dickerson of CBS News. In the U.S., we have conversations out loud about our politicians, what they do wrong or right, how they think, who we support, who we don't, and why. It's the job of a good journalist to approach these politicians in the room, engage with them, ask them questions, and then get useful information to share with all of us, the public, about what they see behind the curtain. The Washington Post has written that when it comes to asking questions, John Dickerson is the master of the game. The way he crafts his ideas is clever and enticing and deeply incisive. President George Bush once told him in a press conference, "I wish you would have given me this question in writing ahead of time so I could have planned for it." Another time, he stumped Hillary Clinton's entire campaign team. All the while, he did it artfully, not fighting, just asking questions that really made people think. There are many people in our live audience who enjoy asking guests these same type of questions, so we all appreciated the chance to listen and learn from John, and we hope you do too. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
So to start off, Mr. Dickerson, I got to ask you, what makes a good political interview?
That's a good question. It depends how much time you have. I don't mean for my answer. I mean in general for the interview. And it depends what kind of politician you're talking about. If you're talking about, some of the most best and most interesting political interviews could be with an old, small time politician who's in a smaller venue, a mayor or a local politician who understands the transactions that take place in the political world at a basic ground level and understands about people and what they expect of politics. Then you have true practitioners, either those who've run races or are involved in understand the difference between accumulating power through campaigns and then using power in office. There are a lot of people who are good at one or the other, but not good at both. And then there are political scientists. You could have a fantastic, and often some of the best conversations are with political scientists who are not stricken with the malady that those of us who cover politics have to be really careful about, which is the tendency to assume that history is existing right now and that there was never any history before, or who assume that a lot of what we've experienced in our own lives represents patterns of behavior, when in fact the patterns of behavior can be quite different from what we think we see, or the motivations we have because we're in a business that studies what happens right in front of our eyes. There was a long time in the career that I overemphasized the rhetorical talents and skills of politicians. When you talk to the political scientists, they will remind you that that's highly overrated in its ability to move people and change political positions. So there are a lot of political scientists with whom you can have a great conversation if you're willing to step back from the freneticism of the moment. And then you have lawmakers who are in office right now, where a good political interview means getting them to either tell you something close to the truth, getting you to give you some insight, not just about what's happening in the next 10 seconds, but what's happening in the political system as a whole. Or I always used to try to get politicians to think out loud, which is to show you, if they're a president or if they're an executive, how they make decisions, and give you some insight into the clockworks that goes on inside their head.
So following up with that, the presidents, the chief generals, the heads of state, when you're interviewing those type of people that just have a gravitas and a stature, how do you balance the need to ask challenging questions with the natural deference that comes to figures of this stature? Is there a right or wrong way to ask these questions?
Well, it depends, again, on the venue and who you're talking to and what you're trying to get out of it. Michael Lewis once wrote a piece, I believe it was for Time, about John McCain. And he basically said, in the news environment, and apologies to Michael if I'm mangling what he wrote, because I think he wrote it in 96. So it was a few years ago. In the news diet, there are all kinds of different ways to interview lawmakers and politicians and candidates. There's a place for a wise journalist who is close to the source, give you some insight to that source, that comes from a position of empathy or closeness. In other words, it's not a Perry Mason interview. Now, on the other hand, you can't have just that. So you need to have plenty of interviews that are really hard hitting and almost prosecutorial, because frankly, anybody who runs for president should be brave enough to face real questioning. And anybody who's smart enough to run for president should know that if they can face real questioning, it's going to make them look better as politicians. The problem we've slipped into is a lot of people who run for president just speak to their own side. And that's a problem that has ramifications for our public discourse, but it also makes for weak candidates. And weak candidates make for weak legislators, and it's because they don't get testing. And they aren't tested on whether they have the skills and attributes for the job they're running for. But in a conversation with somebody who's running for president, they're running to be president, so they are owed. You shouldn't be a jerk, but you're asking to give them a tremendous amount. And so, if you focus on that, the kind of deference falls away, because it's not you've got a serious job to do. And the same is true with military leaders. I mean, they have extraordinary power, and they have extraordinary power over the lives of people who can't ask these questions. And so, it's your job to be the representative of those people, and to try and, if the interview calls for it at that moment, is to ask questions that are tough and probing and are going to get you somewhere.
So let's go a little bit further and paint the picture. Let's say you have 30 minutes, 60 minutes, you're one-on-one in a feature-length interview with a presidential candidate, maybe like you were with President Trump when he was president, or like you said, a military general. When one of those people is being evasive, you mentioned prosecutorial, but how do you know when to continue pressing on follow-ups, balancing that with potentially being disrespectful or running through your interview time allotment?
Well, that you've come to the edge of the tolerance of the person you're interviewing when they kick you out of their office. So you probably want to stop short doing that. On the other hand, when that happened to me, I had more questions I wanted to ask. So, I think you should remember your job is to be a window pane and not be the show. People shouldn't notice you. They should notice the person you're interviewing. And so a lot of the theatrics of some modeling, I think, gets in the way of and detracts from the job, which is to give people a window onto the person. By the way, if I had a half an hour or 60 minutes, boy, I would love it. That would be great, because then you have a chance to really explore the person you're interviewing. But I think, and with President Trump, who was the last president I interviewed in office, I did have a lot of time with him. the challenge with President Trump, of course, was that he filibustered a lot. So and when I interviewed him, there was quite a lot to talk about, particularly because the effort to kill the Affordable Care Act was well underway. And one of the things I thought was important was to illuminate the extent to which he understood the elements of his replacement plan, or the one that was being put through Congress, because it was at a point where there were some trade-offs being discussed and the elements of the plan were being discussed. And this was it was 100 days into his administration. So it was the first he had sold himself as a great negotiator. So was he negotiating the component parts of the replacement to the Affordable Care Act? Did he understand them? Did he? So there was a lot of time spent talking about the ins and outs of healthcare, not to get a specific answer, but to show viewers, to give them a sense, they could make up their own mind. As he tried to explain what was in the bill, whether he had command of of what was in his legislation or the legislation he was promoting, and that ate up a lot of the clock. So it was a little tense because there was a lot to get to. So your calculation is always, do I spend enough time on this, even if they're filibustering, to illuminate something that's worthwhile, recognizing that the more time we spend in this area, the less time I'll have to spend in other areas that might be more fruitful. And as political scientists will tell you, a lot of politicians want to hold territory and stay on that territory, because if a politician is talking about issue X, even if they're not talking about it very cogently or very well, it helps them to be talking about issue X because that's an issue that works well for them or their party. And so you don't want to fall into that trap. So there's a lot that goes through your head as you're going through these interviews, and you're always looking at trees, trying to figure out, is this worth going down this road? Am I going to illuminate something? Am I going to lose people? Am I going to burn time that would be better spent on some other question?
So I want to transition away from maybe some of your experiences into what you've seen in the media and how it's evolved. Specifically, over the last 3 decades, we've seen huge media fracturing and an ever more divisive and vitriolic politics. I mean, COVID, January 6th, so on and so forth. Which is driving which? Is the media responding to public demand, or is the public mostly responding to what they're consuming?
You're asking me a chicken and egg question. And I don't know that I have an intelligent answer because my mind is captivated at the moment about trying to think what I think about social media and the way in which the structure of social media drives what we see, what we understand, both in social media where we think we control things, which is to say what we post and send to our friends and family, and also what the algorithms of those social media platforms are feeding us, and the way in which that shapes our thinking, shreds our attention, and changes the way in which we consume things. So that, at the moment, is not an answer to your question, but it's just something that's that I think about a lot. So I think. But I think there are things that I can say that are true, even if I don't come to a conclusion. I mean, there was a day when 29 million people watched Walter Cronkite, and that common basic basis of information, created a national conversation or a national set of facts. Now, that isn't to say that there wasn't a large portion of America that was angry about the fact that what they were seeing on the news didn't represent what they thought about the country or what they saw. And there was a lot of politics that existed, much as it does today, in opposition to the mainstream media, which was essentially 3 television networks, at least in the television space. And now we have this atomized media environment where you have both a number of different kinds of legacy media, you have new media, and then you have social media. As people have been able to control where they go and get their information, obviously the kind of information has changed, and it's either changed to get more partisan or it's changed shorter. Look at the length of interviews on programs 10, 15 years ago, and look at the length of interviews now. The emphasis on the superficial and the emphasis on the quick and the immediate and the loudest and latest has always been something that the news business has had to struggle with. it's even more so at the moment. And, the response of readers who we can now measure, who will spend a lot more time on a salacious and shiny piece of journalism than a well-considered long piece of journalism, not in every case, but often, does have an effect on the marketplace. And again, as I say, it doesn't happen all the time. There are definitely good long reads and incredible investigative reporting that breaks through. But on the day-to-day experience, the media has responded to this marketplace. And then finally, when I say the word media, I could mean any number of things. And that's been a problem too, because it's in the interest of various actors, both political and others, to sort of define the media as basically by the worst behavior of somebody with a public megaphone. And that's not exactly right. You still have media outlets, even in this new environment, that have incredibly strict standards, and where people can get fired for saying things that are wrong, and particularly for saying things they know are wrong. And there are levels of checking. And those news organizations operate in the same environment with people who can say any old thing. And that has created a kind of noisiness in the environment that also affects the way in which our work is consumed.
So I do want to hone in on social media, especially with the whistleblower and how relevant to news. But you mentioned the big three. You mentioned Walter Cronkite. I'm wondering, in this fractured, partisan information ecosystem where everybody's siloed, where do the big networks fit in terms of political coverage?
Well, where the networks fit in is there's still a place where millions of people get their news, or millions of busy people who live in a world where your attention is constantly being shredded, come for news that hopefully explains what's going on and puts what's going on in context. The noisier it gets, the more important it is to have a place you can go where you trust what you're getting, and where what you're getting is official, but is a little bit deeper and richer. And particularly with television news, it can be richer because you have correspondents who can go where the news is, who can show you things and use the power of images, which, as somebody who came out of the news magazine world, there's a lot of writing you can do when you're using images. And so, you can make the case, and I think it's true, that there's more reason for kind of old-fashioned news in the television sense than there was before, because it's so frantic out there. Now, the immediate flip side of that, or not the flip side, but what has to be said immediately thereafter is whether people are really interested in that, or whether people are interested in something that's either more entertaining, or whether people are more interested in reading something that gets their blood going than reading something that explains what defaulting on the debt will do to their adjustable rate mortgages. And, hopefully you find a happy medium. But, the tyranny of choice is that while there is a place for television news, people have more opportunity to go elsewhere.
Yeah, and just following up on that, with social media especially, what impact do you think it has had on our news coverage? I'm going to be specific, maybe with some of our print journalism, and especially dealing with the economic pressures that outlets face, especially local news, but also some of the cable news. What influence do you think social media has had on those type of news ventures, not so much the networks?
Well, to the extent that social media has allowed people who operate in smaller venues with smaller traditional audiences, it's a way for their work to ricochet all over the world when their work is good and illuminates important questions. And so social media can be glorious and wonderful. On the other hand, it can also be a vinegary, attention-destroying engine that turns the news business into degenerating conversation of the same, not necessarily important minutia. And it can be awful, and particularly when it comes to campaigns. I used to argue that basically if you're a campaign reporter, you should stay off of social media. Now, that was after the 2012 election. I don't think anybody can do that anymore. But, it's incredibly distracting. And also the emphasis on constantly being in social media for news organizations or for reporters is warping. And I certainly feel it myself. And I don't mean from a partisan standpoint. I just mean your job as a journalist is to react slowly and with restraint, and to check things out, and to see the larger picture, and to contextualize things, and to check your facts, and to seek to explain, not to inflame. And social media is designed, as we now know, literally designed to strip away all of that and to encourage all of the opposite behaviors. And reporters are human beings, and human beings, are affected by that career. And it can be, very distracting. But the really good reporters are able to manage that, and it makes what they do all the more impressive. And we know that they are impressive because often their work gets sent around in social media. So it's a little bit complex, like most things.
So I guess one aspect of social media is maybe it's exacerbated the natural tendency of us to experience shared information bias, confirmation bias, a whole host of biases, but basically get information that we immediately like, and then get in a group of people that also like that information. They share it around, and their beliefs are kind of reinforced. It's also created information silos and information bubbles. In the post-social media world, John, do you think it's possible to return to a shared set of facts? And is that even the right question I should be asking you? Is returning to a shared set of facts how we kind of depolarize things, or is there another way we should go about it?
Well, again, social media can expose you to a whole host of different points of view and different cuts on things. You just have to really tune your social media feed diligently and with a kind of open heart. And maybe not everybody does that. But one of the boons and one of the glorious things about social media is that there are people of good faith who who hold a wide variety of viewpoints. It's just that they happen to be walking into an arena where somebody's also biting the heads off a chicken. And so it gets very hard to distinguish the people of goodwill who are searching, who have judgments but aren't judgmental, and who are willing to exchange views and present their views in a way that doesn't just question the motives of those who feel differently, who aren't trying to bait everybody for attention or to raise money. So you can fight through all of that, but you can find them. You just have to be more diligent, and not everybody can do that because people have busy lives and concerns of their own. So I think one of the shared facts are important. A template for understanding what facts are and how things change, just as we know in our human behavior and in our lives, we come to understandings that are different than what we held at first. And if we allow ourselves that freedom to come to different understandings about things, then we should allow it for others, including the people who are reporting the news and who do the best they can do. But pictures change, situations change. And so people who consume the news should understand that and recognize that and see that an evolving picture is not a picture in which somebody who wrote about or talked about the picture in its first stage was wrong about the final stage. If the Yankees are up in the first inning, it doesn't mean that you were wrong when you said the Yankees were up in the first inning, even though the Red Sox win the game. There's a kind of understanding in the way we consume news that needs to change. And there is a general kind of good-heartedness that needs to be returned to the public square, that is just wholly missing, which is a suppleness about what we understand to be true for ourselves, and also seeking to understand what somebody else is saying rather than just assuming the worst motive is behind whatever it is that they're saying. That kind of stuff is really, really hard to do, especially when the marketplace for ideas incentivizes behavior that, again, is completely the opposite of that. No one ever made thousands of dollars through a fundraising pitch as a politician by saying, my opponent has a point. And I've been flat complexities of this issue, but in fact, it turns out it's a little bit more thorny than I thought. It's going to take some time to resolve. And I might take some of the ideas that my opponent has been talking about because while I don't agree with them, they have elements of them that might be useful. You won't raise any money doing that.
So I guess not to get into policies, but do you think we can reform social media so that maybe some more of those solid voices are held up without government stepping in to create some structural reforms? Or how do you view I'm coming from the perspective that social media is great in a lot of ways, but it's also really, really toxic, especially with campaigning, like you've said. I've experienced it at the RNC, and I'm wondering how we can reform it. Does government need to step in?
I don't know. I'm not very good at prescriptive social media fixes that come from the government realm. So I don't really have a prescription because I tend to see it from the consumer end, and what we need to do, the sort of epistemological hygiene we all need, and the critical thinking skills we need to hone. Because the media is always going to be changing, and the way in which it gets to you is always going to be changing. And the motivations of the people who are delivering you things are going to be modeled. And so we need to be more expert at handling the information we get. And that means going back to, I can't remember, there's the Mr. Finland who said, the place to start combating fake news is in kindergarten. These are habits of thinking and ways of approaching fellow citizens and information that have to start early and that have to kind of be respected by society. And I think that has to be the area where you have solution. I think government efforts to try to fix things, though I'm sure somebody could make the case to me that X, Y, and Z as government interventions would be useful and helpful and salutary. I'm not denying that. I just am ignorant in that area. But I do know that there's going to be enough change in the marketplace that those underlying things I talked about are going to be required. Because however we choose to consume news, you need to have those personal talents and skills for consuming it, regardless of how the news gets to you.
So I have we started this project to try and bring people together, and I really looked at this as an opportunity to get better at asking questions. And I was wondering if you could go into the impact that your mom, Nancy, had for everybody in the audience. Nancy's a very famous and accomplished media personality in her own right. Is she the inspiration for the way that you ask questions? Is she the inspiration for how you got into media? And do you derive a lot of your talent from her? Can you just describe her to us and what you've taken from her?
It's an interesting and question I would have answered a lot of different ways at different stages of my life. The older I've become, and particularly the more time I've spent in television, the more I've become with her talent, and the more forgiving I've been of her as a mother. I was no picnic as a kid, and we didn't have a great relationship. Her career in television was essentially over by the time I was old enough to kind of know what was going on. So I learned about her television career after she had died. She died over 20 years ago, actually. this month. After she died, she had kept everything that she, all of her letters home to her parents, all of her journals, basically everything in her professional life. She wasn't married till late in her 30s, and she didn't have me until she was 42. So there were many different stages of her life that I learned about, and in so doing, learned a lot about the business. I would not have, if you'd asked me when I was a teenager, I would definitely have said, no, I'm not going into journalism. I assumed I would be a writer or a lawyer or maybe go into business. But I sort of stumbled into them from an investigative story I worked on when I started as a secretary at Time Magazine. And I got hooked very quickly. But mostly what I've taken from my mother is a sense of humility about a lot of the judgments I had about her. Because as a woman in news, she was, for those who don't know, she was the first woman newscaster, first female correspondent for CBS News in 1960, because women, they believed that the networks were not serious enough to be delivering the news at a national network, and the audience didn't believe that either, they thought. But finally, they came out from the caves in which they were dwelling and started to hire women, and my mom was lucky enough to be one of them, but that didn't mean things got any easier or any better. And so having to exist in a business television news, which can grind you up and in which people are, exchanged in positions with not necessarily their best interests at heart, you can imagine how much more difficult that was for a woman. And so her grace and ability to endure all of that was really amazing. And she, after NBC didn't renew her contract, she went out on her own and did some amazing work, interviewing Sadat and Begin right after their peace deal, and then winning a Peabody for a documentary on Watergate at a time when you had to go out and sell station to station to station your program. There weren't big, huge networks. So she was getting into a new world, both as a business person, but then also as a journalist, while also carrying, the 50-pound weights on her back of being in a man's industry. So I would like to think that I have some talents that are approaching hers, but I definitely know that my sense of the complexities and difficulties of life have been sharpened by watching her and the way she went through it all.
Yeah, it's probably a lot harder to complain about the news industry after watching her.
Yes, exactly. It was plus, my kids are, generally speaking, wonderful human beings. She didn't quite have that, so she she had to deal with that as well.
It's honestly so hard to believe from who we see on TV, but she did a good job.
Fooled them again.
All right, folks. Now we're going to do audience Q&A, our meat and potatoes of this. We bring you the experts, you bring them the questions. We're going to go with Dr. Terry first, and then John Gunnison. Dr. Terry, do you have a question for John Dickerson?
Thanks so much, Justin. I really appreciate you inviting me up. And, I guess my question is, to come back to, I don't want to get into the chicken and the egg question again, but, it's more about, how do we get to, how do we capture people's attention? And I think you said it, there are people who are watching, you look at the TV shows, people are watching, and maybe, shifting to that gets deeper into story. Well, we have it in Frontline, but I'm just wondering your thoughts about getting people more engaged in these longer theme stories, if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, Dr. Terry, I guess, one way is tell good stories, and people can't look away. Now it's a little, I don't mean to be flip, but it can sound flip, because good stories, they don't grow on trees and they're incredibly expensive. And when we present the news, we're competing not just with other news organizations, but we're competing with the phones everybody has in their hands or the other screens that they have. and that's just a reality. So I don't know. I mean, I think that we can, and it's because there's a lot of things that we have done in the news business to help undermine our work. The competition for eyeballs with peekaboo headlines that are different from what's in the article, from blaring that news is breaking when you've been reporting the same story for 3 days in a row. That accumulates over time, drop by drop, and you create the conditions where somebody no longer has the instinct to turn away from whatever's entertaining them to what you're saying, because they might not think you're on the level. And so that's just one of the things that as an industry we need to solve. I mean, I think there's you need a situation where everybody gets, all of the various people who are involved in trying to make our public square better and the transference of information better need to sort of admit their shortcomings. And once we've admitted them, then sort of say, okay, well, I will stop writing headlines that trick you into reading that doesn't deliver on what the headline says, if you'll actually read the article and not just forward it to your friend with some outrage based on the previous outrage you saw. And that's very, very complicated. I do think these things go in waves, and we have seen the downside of people not paying attention to the best information possible at the time, and we've seen that cost in human lives. And perhaps over time that will induce people to be a little bit better consumers of news. And if they're better consumers of news, they'll perhaps pay more attention to the many people in the business who do the news well and who deliver good, solid information.
Thank you very much, Dr. Terry. We will go to John Gunnison and then Peter Chow next. John, over to you.
Thanks so much for being with us, John. I've watched you on television. I've read you in The Atlantic. It's really a privilege to be able to speak with you. I have a question about something that we talked about a little bit earlier, about the commercial incentives in media. And CBS News has sometimes been part of this conversation because of a quote from Les Moonves that Donald Trump wasn't good for America, but he was good for CBS. And I am curious, of course, it should be said that Mr. Moonves is no longer with CBS for good reason. But I'm curious, was this sort of just a brash comment from a loud executive? Or did the newsroom ever sometimes feel the commercial pressure that was coming from the top? And did people who were working on the news ever feel these kinds of concerns and pressures trickling into the newsroom?
I think, I think yes and no. I think that kind of a comment, there are ways in which our job is centered around our credibility. And, sometimes you feel like you're trying to make a snowball out of like slush in a late spring snow, smashing it together to try to keep your credibility solid, because at heart, you want to tell people stories, you want to learn something and tell people what's going on. That's why we all get in the business. And if you learn a bunch of stuff that you think is worthy of telling people and people don't listen because you've messed it up, then that just hollows you out inside. So at a very basic level, there's no incentive to see the world that way, because it totally undermines the reason we got in the business, what we do. And so that's the kind of basic human level of how a statement like that and that mindset destroys why we all do what we do. Having said that, everybody understands that networks are expensive and there is advertising in the world, and to the extent that I don't know how it's a thing. It exists. People don't. I think it is something that everybody in a newsroom wrestles with, and you hope that basically you're the one who has to just make the decision about your stories, and whether your stories are going to keep watching or not. I think that mostly the ones who have been successful running rooms and the news divisions that I've been a part of, whether it's at Time or Slate or The Atlantic or CBS News, are the ones that are able to say to their journalists, you do what you do, which is tell good stories and tell people what's important and for them to know. And I'll take care of the money part. And you just keep doing what you're doing. And there have been stories at CBS that I've been involved, that ran and that were up that if it was purely about money, it wouldn't have run. And so I've personally had experiences where people have backed that up. But I would be crazy and nobody would believe me anyway if we didn't feel the economic pressures of the business. And it's really up to the executives to be smart enough to know that if you can't find a way to separate the two, you're never going to have any decent journalists until the thing that you need to have living to make your money. And so that's why they get, that's why they're in the positions of power that they're in, because they're skilled, hopefully, at knowing how to keep those two things separate. So it's tricky and gets trickier every day in this environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunnison. We will go to Peter Chow, and then we will go to Dr. Aditi. Peter?
Thanks so much for joining us again, Mr. Dickerson. So my question is about the intersection of media or journalism and science, specifically like the standards for reporting on scientific research. And I think this has particularly been, it's always been happening, but it's particularly acute during the pandemic, which is that the media will report on, let's say incomplete or not quite published, fully published research, whether it's a preprint, they might report on slides, a study that hasn't been released, or even say a press release from Pfizer, something like that. To you, what is the standard that the journalists and objective media should hold when trying to communicate this, especially given, say, the tentative nature, while also weighing it's the need for the information to get out, but also like the legitimacy of science, saying it comes from a research study when folks can't even look up the study or interact with the sources, and that's really the value of science.
Well, it's basically like anything else we report. So it's context. And if it's provisional, which is to say if it's a new study that shows promise but hasn't been verified or is in an early stage, you have to convey that in a way that doesn't give people false hope or false disappointment. You also, and this is what I was talking about earlier about the news business in general, science and the entire business of accumulating knowledge is not linear and is messy. And so, particularly with science, it's important not to convey an excessive level of certainty. So how do you both say, hey, there's this amazing development, which is a genuine breakthrough and represents an advancement, a sufficient advancement in human knowledge or in science that it's notable and worth talking about. And oh, by the way, all the scientists are talking about it. So that is itself news. How do you convey all of that without saying this is the end of time because this thing has been solved? And how do you do that in a minute and 20 seconds? Whatever you do, you've got to make sure you do those things. And I think with an ongoing story, one of the big difficulties with reporting on COVID-19 was the provisional nature of information. The fact that science, like everything else, is you can think it's going one way and then it goes the other way. And that doesn't mean anybody was trying to fool you or sneak something past you, or that the original science was bad in some way. If it was, you should report on that. But it can just mean that the accumulation of knowledge is not a linear thing. And you have to kind of keep reminding people of that. I think of this in the political context where I spend most of my time. On election, a lot better, although we can continue to get better, at saying to people, hey, what we're watching is on election night is a puzzle being put together. And we're really interested in the individual pieces because the whole will be made up of pieces that interlock and fit. And so studying each individual piece is important with respect to how it determines the whole, but also because each individual piece is very interesting. It's an interesting country, and these are interesting things to examine. But when we examine one piece, don't mistake the examination of that piece for the whole. Don't think that we're calling the game in the first at bat. We're just telling you with intense interest how this one has played out, because it's really interesting in its own right, and it's going to tell us something about the larger picture. And there was a breathlessness of previous reporting that suggested everything hinged for the night on whatever is coming out of my mouth right now. And we've gotten a lot better at saying, this takes a long time, the picture will change, it necessarily changes. History is full of changes and things that go different ways than people thought. Just ask Andrew Jackson in 1824. And so stick with us. Don't get a false impression, even though we're really interested in these new results that are coming in. I think that basically science should be handled in the same way, and you shouldn't take a study not from a reputable source in the same way you wouldn't take reputable polling if you're talking about political races.
We will go over to Dr. Aditi and then to Evan. We got about 10 minutes left. So Dr. Aditi, over to you.
Thanks so much, Justin. John, it's such an honor. You are truly a legend. You know, my question, I'm a physician and I have been increasingly working in the media during the pandemic. My question to you, as someone who's worked in politics for decades, is what sorts of thoughts or advice do you have for those of us who are either apolitical or not really interested in politics, but have been thrust into a political arena or context simply because of the work that we do? You know, I'm speaking specifically about the politicization of COVID and how it's truly just a health and medical issue, but so much more in the context of everything that's happened. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Aditi, it's tricky. I think the first thing I go back to is what Amanda Ripley, who is an author and journalist, in the first days of the pandemic, we were talking about, she had written about disasters and kind of how different disasters are handled and managed. And we talked a lot about the public information piece of any disaster. And her point was essentially, in a disaster, the kind of best rules of thumb are: be straight up with people about what you know and what you don't know. Be straight up about how things might change. And if they change, it's because you've gotten new information, not because you were particularly wrong the first time, because it's a moving picture. And to be transparent, because while it might be a little uncomfortable, the penalty of not being transparent and then being wrong is deadly. It's like, my mother used to say about first impressions at school. I mean, if the first impression is that you're lying to them or not giving them the straight story, then that's the one that locks in. Incredibly hard to undo that. I think it also depends on who your audience is. If you have a generous audience who are coming to you in a posture of searching and seeking for information, then you're in luck. If you have an audience that is searching and seeking for spears with which to turn around and aim at you, who is constantly on a hair trigger to judge you based on their preconceptions about your motives, then you've got more work to do. And one of your first jobs is really to listen and understand what kind of audience you have, what their fears are, what their blind spots are, and so that your information can land in the most comfortable posture possible. If you know you've got a hostile audience, then you need to find out what the root of their hostility is, which is really hard because sometimes the root is not the articulated root, right? There's always something behind it. And Amanda Ripley has written a great book called High Conflict about all of these issues. And it's great to have public conflict. Partisanship is not necessarily a bad thing. We adjudicate ideas in the public square through competition. And so argumentation and debate is crucial and necessary to sharpen ideas. But what we don't want to lapse into is high conflict, where nobody's listening, and where the point of argumentation is to defeat and destroy the other person. So listening and accommodating the views of the audience that you're with, accommodating by the sense of not telling them what they want to hear, but telling them in a way that doesn't immediately set them off, requires intense listening and a period of listening that we might not always have. But I would say essentially listen and be transparent and try really hard not to give in to the escalating emotional responses, which lead to high conflict and which are really hard because they're human. But that can get you in a position where then once you would get into high conflict, you're sort of doomed, because nobody's arguing based on the facts anymore. They're just arguing to win what they think of as a life and death competition.
Thank you, Dr. Aditi. We will go to Evan next. Evan, over to you, good sir.
Thank you. And John Dickerson, thank you so much for sharing your views here and your time. You're such a prolific creator of content, whether it's your books, your podcasts, obviously television. Maybe you could share with us what's your favorite communications channel, spoken word versus written word versus television, and why? Would love your insights there. Thanks so much.
Oh, that's a great question, because I wish I answered for it, which is my favorite questions to get, because it makes me sort of think out loud. So let's see if I can do that. It depends on what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to say, and the emotional tenor and tone of what I'm writing. Sometimes it's also, I guess, as I'm saying this, I think you can achieve powerful emotional stories. You just do them differently, and I guess that's what I'm fumbling around with. Because my first instinct for certain kinds of stories is to write them, because I spent 25 years as a magazine writer. So for me, things that are personal and intimate, I tend to write them, but often. And I've had some great producers, damn them, who have said, "You're going to write about this for TV." And I thought, I don't have those skills. I can't do that on TV in the way I would in a piece of writing, which to me feels more intimate. And because they forced me to do it, I've found ways to build that skill set. And so I'm really lucky that I've worked for people who've forced me to do that. There's no substitute really, though, for the beauty that an editor can bring to a piece in television when you write and they marry it with the images, and to stop writing and let the images do the work, where an interview that you watch is so much more powerful than words that you just read on a page. There are some times where conversation to me, I've done a lot of interviews in my life, and now a lot on TV, where there is only a certain kind of information that you can convey for other people through communication. So through me having a conversation with another person. And what's beautiful about that is that you create this space between yourself and the person you're interviewing, where you have revelation, and discovery, and Stephen Colbert talks about this brilliantly, discovery that takes place in a communal setting. It's the two of you working out an idea together, and the revelation happens in the space between you. When you have an audience, they get to join in that space, and they're having the revelation as you're having the revelation, and you are building something together, the three of you, the audience and the two people speaking, and that's impossible to do. So there's the beauty of images that are a part of a television piece that you can't match in print. And then there's that power that comes from interviews that take place on television. That's not true. It doesn't work in print. For the kind of needle point I like to do with description that holds people in a moment and makes them go back to it and makes them revisit it. That's where I tend to think of print more. And then finally on podcasts, I've been blessed to work with the same people for 15 years on the Gabfest. And it was the spirit of discovery, coming to views, getting them destroyed, coming up with new views, going back to old views, the freedom to think out loud with two really smart people. It has engendered a sort of sense of discovery for me that's been really useful in all of my other work, including then the Whistle Stop podcast I did, which grew completely out of the previous podcast I did, or I do. And that's a more informal, colloquial, but hopefully with the same journalistic precision. And it's a voice that never had in the other two venues. So I think that's all of it. I won't talk about my work in interpretive dance because, nobody wants to hear about that.
So I ask all of our guests this, and especially in a time of massive polarization between neighbors, between news outlets, between everything that we kind of consume, what do you want to leave the audience with on last thoughts? It can be about anything. It could be positive, negative, somewhere in between. But what do you want to leave us with, Mr. Dickerson?
I guess what I want to, I don't know. I guess I would just, I always get uncomfortable with the leave you with part. So I guess what I would just say is what, to the extent anybody's found any of this interesting or worthwhile, I think the way I approach the work that we do and the world we live in and the people we interact with is with a sense of discernment, but not judgment, with a recognition of their humanity, that the difficulties and struggles of our own individual lives are magnified in other people, and to kind of recognize that first and remember as a shield against all of us that pull us to do the opposite. And that's something that I spent a lot of time working on and thinking about and struggling to do. And so I guess to the extent that here we are on a social media platform, is to spend some time maybe being hyper intentional about having the most generous possible interpretation of someone's viewpoint or what they're saying. And if they prove you wrong after close examination, then don't be a fool. But approach it from a human perspective first, and maybe that will leach a little bit of the animosity out of our public conversations, if enough of us do that as our first starting proposition, recognizing, of course, that doing so doesn't mean that you surrender your reason or your critic.
It appears that is all we have for you today. If you liked or disliked what you heard, if you want to find out where to join us live to listen or maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or if you have any feedback for us, good or bad, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founder Justin Higgins and I and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.